Hello.
Thank you, folks, for joining.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Thank you, folks, for joining us today. First of all, thank you, CMUTE, for providing this platform for bringing us all together, and all thanks to Chitiz for bringing us all together here today. So the way we'll go about this session today is we'll talk for 30 minutes, do a panel discussion where I'll moderate that session, and then we'll open the floor for any questions from the audience. To start with, I'd like our panelists today, Aditya, Sachi, and Deepak, to introduce themselves. Aditya, if you could go first.
Sure thing. Thank you, Amar, for having us, and Kshitij for setting up this amazing event. Quick introduction about myself. I'm Aditya Amonkar, passed CMU in 2010 out of the MSISPM program. After the program, I got into what I call as the media and news industry, and I've been working in it for the past several years. I'm currently a product manager at Roku in the Bay Area, live in San Francisco, and interested in all things media. I think media has played an important part in everything that we touch and do today. So excited to be in this space and happy to answer any questions you might have. So that's my introduction.
Awesome. Thanks, Aditya. Deepak?
Yep, sure thing. Yeah, thanks everybody for setting this up. Looking forward to talking to everybody for the next 1 hour. So about myself, I did my MBA at CMU, MBA. So I was with the Tepper School of Business. Now, I graduated in 2019. I've been with Google ever since. So I'm a product manager in our cloud business, mainly around the fulfillment space. So like some of my biggest customers are like the different areas within cloud, right? Like we have ads, YouTube, and all of the different companies within Google and within Alphabet. And we basically aim to serve capacity to each of our business partners. It's been an exciting journey so far. I'd love to talk more about it during the questions that come forward.
Awesome. Sachi?
Yeah, hey everyone, good to see everyone here. It's always exciting to kind of find ways to pay it forward. I was a student not too long ago. I was class of 2021 undergrad. I actually started my journey at CMU as a fine arts major, and then kind of got really involved in the Short Center and was an innovation scholar. If anybody else is here, please type that in the group chat. Would love to connect with you all. And then my junior year, I ended up doing sort of a self-defined major, which if any of you know, that is a possibility, I think at the undergrad level. Where if you have a major idea that doesn't exist, you can propose it. So mine was called Leadership in Creative Enterprise, and it was sort of the intersection between art, design, and business. And so currently I work at Adobe as a product manager. I'm in the Creative Cloud division, which is very much in line with my passions of solving for creative needs. And I'm specifically on a team called Assets and Collaboration. And it's all about how do we make our cloud collaborative and make it an ecosystem. So really exciting stuff, and happy to be here to talk more about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for three of you for joining us today for this panel discussion. To introduce myself, I am Amar. I am a PM at Meta right now. I graduated from CMU in 2020 from this program called MS in Product Management. And before joining CMU, I was an entrepreneur for almost 6 years, running a startup back in India. To kick us off for this session, what I would like our panelists to share is how does their day-to-day look like as a PM? Realizing the fact that as a PM, different organizations, different team, different products that you build have very different needs, skills, knowledge that are required. And each of these places that you work has very different style of product management. To share that with you, I'd like Sachi to kick us off with how does her day-to-day look like?
Yeah, for sure. And Amar, I think this is an awesome question, because especially as sort of like fresh to the world PM, I know kind of going into it, there's a lot of ideal descriptions of what a PM does, and they were always like very high level and not very tactile. I'm like, what does it really mean to work at the intersection of design, business, and technology? Because that's like, the description a lot of us have heard. So I would preface this by saying, even within like a company like Adobe, I think the experiences of every PM differs depending on what team you're on, what product you're on. So my experience has been, I was lucky enough to be put on a team working on a new product that has yet to hit the market. Hopefully you'll see it as a beta app around the August timeframe. But sort of my daily responsibilities are split between user research. So we're currently in an internal beta phase where we're testing the product within Adobe Design. And the other half of my duties are sort of like driving our roadmap and the vision of this product. And the two are sort of interconnected because the feedback we get from users is sort of what directly goes into roadmap prioritization, the choices we're making. And we work in a pretty iterative system in the sense that we launch new features every month. And then with that, it's tied into our internal beta process where we have those features tested by internal users, see if they like it or not, and kind of continue iterating on the product. So I would say those are my two like main functions, but every day really does look different because it depends on what feature we're driving and building within that month. Some features are very like cross-dependent on other teams. And so I'll be in meetings with a subset of people that I've never been in meetings with before. So it's really interesting. And I think that fact that I've heard about being a PM really stands true, which is that there's no monotonous day. There's no predictable day. And to me, that's like one of the most interesting parts of the jobs. And the other thing that I think rings to be true is there's a lot of meetings. There's a lot of goddamn meetings. So you better, be prepared to enjoy talking and be prepared to enjoy being in meetings for a lot of your day, because at least that's been my experience.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Sachi. And yeah, I can testify that days cannot be predictable. Deepak, would you like to share how your day-to-day looks like? What are you working on?
Yeah, sure thing. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely very much a very new day every single time I look at my calendar. It's I like to color my meetings based on what kind of work that I'm doing, and it's like a different colorful palette each time. So to answer this question, actually kind of interesting I was just taking a look at my calendar to see like what kind of meetings I had today, and kind of talk about the different ones. So it all depends upon what phase I feel like you're in your journey of your product. So part of the meetings were with my engineering team, where I'm following up on what's the status of the different projects that we had in flight, answering their questions, making sure that I'm unblocking them to get towards launch. So that's one of the parts of a product manager, to make sure that your products are getting towards success. Some of my other meetings were with customers. So we had a few customer sessions where my job was to talk about the new product releases, increase adoption, increase engagement with users on the product proposals that we have. That's one of the key roles that we do as well, trying to make sure that whatever product you're launching, you're getting the necessary customer support for it and increasing engagement with users. A lot of my meetings today actually ended up in this new product proposal that I was putting together and getting buy-in from my engineering team, from my product leadership team around this product proposal. So this was a culmination of a few weeks of effort where I had put together a doc, got some feedback from my manager, and these meetings were all about sitting with the engineering leadership team, sitting with the product leadership team, explaining my proposal, and taking in questions they have and feedback and improving on it. So as you can see, these can be very different things that you're doing, but you end up having to pack your day with these different actions. So being able to context switch from one meeting to another is one of the skills that I would say really pays off, and something you might want to start developing. But yeah, that's how my day looked like today.
Awesome. I really like the idea of color paletting your own calendar. Aditya, would you like to share the same?
Sure. Means very similar to everything Deepak and Sachi has said, but I'm going to talk a little bit different about how I've faced it my career at Roku, right? So I started off as a very early employee at Roku when we had nothing. Things were built in Excel, and a lot of that time was firefighting. And now, as we build product and matured a bit, I think it's a little more of meetings, right? Which is nobody's game, but you have to be part of it. The way I define my day, right, is one of three things. Again, to Deepak's point on where the product is, it's either in the discovery session where you're talking to users, you're trying to figure out why we have to build something, rationalizing. Second part could be, the defining or the planning for it, like UX designs, talk to users, user research, talking to users, figuring out what the mocks are, and designs. And the third part is executing and trying to get a product shipped, right? And I think all three of them are fun. I think currently I'm working on two different aspects of things. So I'm shifting my priorities a bit. But one of the things that I've tried to do in this pandemic is being part of many meetings sometimes is detrimental to progress, right? And so I keep some part of my day for initial part of the day for just writing PRDs. And I think that time is where I'm most creative. So I think the first 2 hours I'm trying to not have meetings as much as possible, and the rest of the day, because once you start meetings, it just goes by very quickly and you have to context switch a lot. So I think one of the skill sets that PMs are known for is being in multiple meetings and multitasking. Sometimes it hurts you because you're not trying to think of strategic things. And I'll just try to give this audience that we need to be mindful of that. So day goes by very quickly in meetings. So.
Well, I'm glad that you're able to block 2 hours every morning. That's amazing. That's still a wish list for me.
Oh, I have to get up 2 hours earlier for that, man. So I'm not saying that, but it happens.
Awesome. One question that when I was looking for a PM role, and I was at CMU, was how did these people get their first PM job? And that's something I feel a lot of people in our audience are also curious about. Would any one of you would like to say or talk about how did you get to your first PM job? If not, I will pick a name.
I can hop in. So, I think the most interesting thing about PM is I don't think there is like any conventional or set path to get to PM. Obviously, there's stories we hear about often, but I don't think there's one set path. And I would hope that my story can testify to that, having been an art major. But I would say like this, it's sort of like the root of it began when I took a like entrepreneurship trip through the Schwartz Center out to the Bay. And at this point, it was still a full-fledged art major. And I remember for all the startups we visited, the PM was sort of a role that stood out to me. I didn't even know what a product manager was. I didn't know that role existed. I didn't have any like context to it, but I felt like what they were doing was very interesting. And one of the details that stood out to me was like the PM at one of the startups we visited had sort of like a quote wall behind her desk full of user quotes. And I was like, wait, that's pretty cool. Like why do you have that? And like, what's the purpose of that? And she kind of like sat me down and explained about how PMs have to be very like user facing and kind of make decisions based off of that. And so when I came back to CMU, that was my junior year, at the very beginning of my junior year, I was like very inspired to learn more about product. And so I think like the first steps I took was to kind of create this degree that was around that intersection. And in terms of how I landed that job, I actually had my first PM internship through one of the companies I met on that trek. And the company was called Deserve. It's like a fintech startup that's working in the credit card space. And so I was introduced to Jeremy Glassenberg, who was the PM, the head of product at the time, and very much took a chance to give me an internship that ended up being a 10-month internship because I hit the pandemic and decided to take fall of my senior year off and work on that. And so I think like having obviously direct tactile product experience through an internship is very helpful when leading into sort of your full-time product role, because you can like easily validate that you have some of that experience. But I don't necessarily think it's necessary, especially if you're trying to break into product from an undergrad level. And I think the reason being most undergrads don't have PM experience prior to them graduating. They might have an internship, but they might not. And so it's really, for me, I think a big part of it was owning my narrative and really showing how my narrative was sort of lended itself to relevant experiences and a relevant insight into that particular team or product team. In this case, for Adobe Creative Cloud, like having the perspective of being an end user as a creative was really helpful. So the other thing is like, I think networking plays a huge role in any job, but I think especially PM, you have to be willing to put yourself out there. And I think there's a lot of bias around the word networking, but I think going into any opportunity curious and open to learn more. And so for me, when I was in this phase of like exploring what product meant, that just meant like setting up coffee chats on LinkedIn. And I know this sometimes comes more intuitively to some people than others, but I think just curiosity is not something you're ever going to be punished for. And so one of the sort of serendipitous things that happened was for this Adobe role, I actually thought I was going to continue on and do my master's at CMU through the MIPS program because I felt like I needed more time to specialize. But Adobe was recruiting at CMU for software engineers specifically. And so they had like an online recruiting session, but I just showed up and I got put in a room and I was like, not an engineer, zero technical background, but like, here's my resume, I'm interested in product. And that resume was handed to a relevant recruiting manager, and I ended up getting my first interview through that. So I think, long story short, I think couple main takeaways are like, own your narrative, like know what your narrative is and see how that aligns with like any companies you're targeting. 2, like be open to opportunities and don't go into like networking thinking that you want to gain something, because oftentimes like that's going to burn you. It's more go into it open-minded. You won't know what that might result in. And yeah, I think those are my main 2 takeaways from how I landed this role.
Awesome. That's a fantastic story. Anything to add, Deepak, Aditya?
Yeah, that was really interesting. I like what you talked about, just walking into a room when it was actually a software engineering interview and handing in your resume. I think some of the underrated things that you can do to put yourself out there. So that's awesome. It's somewhat, I can talk about some of the things that I went through as I was going through this process. I guess there are 2 phases here, right? Like first, you realize you want to get into product management, and then you start figuring out what are the ways you can get there based on what experience you have and what opportunities you have ahead, right? And for me, before coming to MBA, my goal was to get into product management, and this was something that I had built. Maybe we can talk about this in a later question, but based on what I'd seen in my current job, and I like working with product managers, so I wanted to get to this role. But I had no prior experience in product management, and I thought MBA was like it helps you really get the job you're getting to. But what I learned is that there's a lot of work that you need to put in once you start your course. And this was a struggle, right? Like when you do not have prior PM experience and you have, like, say, engineering experience, it was hard to get noticed by recruiters because they tend to see that you have a lot of engineering experience, but not enough customer-facing experience. And it was a repeated cycle of application rejection for a few months during the whole internship process. And up to a point where I started realizing that this kind of blind applications wasn't really helping me. And what I ended up doing was, like, some of the things that Sachi just talked about, right? Like, you networking, not for the sake of getting a job, but to just learn about the role, right? Like, what I ended up doing was reaching out to my like Tepper alumni and just who are product managers, and just asking for 15 minutes of their time, introduce myself for like 2 minutes, ask them what does a product management mean to them for like 5 minutes, and end the call by asking them if they know of any opportunities in teams they have, right? I was just approaching it by trying to understand what a product manager does. And I realized that I learned so much that way. Like no course is going to teach you what a product manager does. And a recruiter is going to expect you to perform on day one. Like, they're not going to get somebody who has no idea what a PM does and hire you as a PM. So by talking to like 20, 30 alumni, I was able to build my own understanding of what a PM actually does. And that really, and along the way, I was also able to get opportunities through alumni and through these networking calls. And these kind of efforts ultimately led me to land my first internship, do my interviews well. And once you have an internship, some kind of an experience where you can put a product manager as a title in your resume, things just change up quite a bit. So when I went into my second year, I got a few more recruiters who were willing to, at least give me the first interview. And I mean, once you get the interview, I guess it's a process of how to crack your interview and perform well there. And it worked out for me at that point. But the starting point can be a really tough process, and there are different ways that you can try to get there. So this was my journey.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Deepak. Aditya had talked about time management and context switching as skills that a PM must have. I wanted to dig deeper into that to understand what are the skills that you feel a product management must have, like absolute skills that they need to have to be good PMs.
You want me to go first?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I think about this a lot coming into this panel. I think what the brass tacks comes down to, right? I think one is obviously, as both Deepak and Sachi mentioned, is that when you're in a PM role, I think you have an ability to influence, right? You have an ability to work with many different sets of peoples. And so one is that you have to be vested into, good trends. You have to enjoy building new stuff. I think that's very important, so that because that interest comes in when you talk to different people, you have to show excitement. Not always are you going to get a chance where you want to build something and everyone's on board. So that genuine excitement is absolutely important, and it comes through just building yourself as a product manager. That's one. I think empathy is the second thing, where once you're talking about, when you're talking to users, a lot of time where I've realized is that users don't always come to you with the real problem they're having. They'll come with you with a symptom, what I call it, right? And your job as a really good PM is to figure out why they have the problem, what can you solve for. And I think ability to have patience, empathy is very important. And then, so I think from a user perspective, those are the two skill sets. The excitement is what I'm important, and the empathy. And then I think it's very important, as we all work in tech industry, to be able to talk the talk with engineering, right? So you may not be a full-fledged engineer. I think all of us are CMU grads. So I think there's a bit of tech that is obviously needed, but be able to kind of explain things easily to engineers, right? Because you are the mediator between the users and the engineers and the data guys who are be able to talk. And I think what really is successful is to take a complicated issue, put data around it, make sure that it makes sense, and then sell that to engineering. And I think that's what is going to get you far, because your success depends on how successful your products that you ship are, and ability to be a well-rounded character really helps over there. So I think those are, for me, it's a loaded answer, but I think you have to be well-rounded.
Yeah, that sums it up really well. Folks, Kshitij has shared a Slido link in the chat. And if you have any questions that you want to ask our panelists today, please feel free to add your questions there. We will open up the floor for audience questions in about 2 to 3 minutes. So before we do that, I have one last question for our panelists, is how to go about networking. Sachi and Deepak touched upon it a little bit, but I would like to dig deeper. As in, what is the approach? Whom should you reach out to? And what are the questions or conversations that you should have with these people that you're reaching out to? Deepak, if you would like to go first.
Sure. I think I touched on this a little bit in my previous answer. That's kind of like the approach that I took. And it's something I found networking to be really hard when I first started off. When I first started on my MBA, I was wondering, what is it that I should be doing? Is it something nice to actually ask somebody for a 15-minute call? But what worked really well for me was realizing that when you're a student, you actually have a superpower, right? Especially when you're a student, right? Everybody's going to give you 15 minutes of their time because they've been as a student before. They know that they're going to support you in your kind of career growth as well. So approaching the networking call with a learning mindset and not you're trying to get something out of them was really helpful for me. Just letting them know that I just need some time from you to understand what is it that you do as a PM, and keeping in mind that time constraint, right? Don't take too much of their time. Just ask them those few important questions and then wind down the call. I feel like just making sure that you reach out more and having learning mindset worked out the best for me.
Awesome. Yeah. Sachi, would you like to share your thoughts about it as well?
Yeah, I think networking is in some ways something you can actively go seek, but it's also something that can happen to you. And I think for that sort of second part, I have always been of the belief that a really effective way of making opportunities come to you is to really critically evaluate what do you care about, and then sort of create a narrative around that, and be very public about those things you care about. And whether that means having a presence where you write blog posts about that, or you have an active Twitter where you talk about those things. So there's a recent undergrad hire in our team that had no PM experience, but he was really interested in Adobe libraries, which if anybody doesn't know, it's basically this space where you can reference shared assets and colors and brand identity, and you can reuse that in any creative artifact you're making. And he was super into sports, sort of designing for in a sports context, and he would tweet all the time about libraries. And so the libraries PM sort of took notice to him because he had this sphere of influence within the libraries world and realized he understood the product and user needs at such a nuanced level. Like, that's what you need as a PM, maybe not necessarily formal training. And so I think thinking about what you care about and making sure that you are sort of creating a user voice around that, I think is a really great way for that to attract networking to you rather than you blindly seeking it. And the other thing being, if you identify what that thing is that you care about, maybe it's Web3. We're in a world with Web3 now in San Francisco. Go actively seek experiences or events that relate to that rather than events, blanket targeted towards product management. Go to Web3 socials, go, join blog posts or like, communities around that. So I think that's another sort of way of more organically networking, quote unquote.
Awesome. Yeah.
Amar, I'm going to add a few couple of things, I think, because I think it's very meaningful, right? And again, maybe it's things of not to do when you're networking, right? I think I fully agree with Sachi about the important thing about networking is about first knowing yourself, what you want to get out of it, right? And creating a brand, right? I think and I've failed, I've done this too, and I had to reiterate myself or pivot myself, is that think about it on the other side, right? If you're reaching out to Amar for networking options, right? Amar gets 10, 12, 15 requests like a month, right? He needs to pick and choose. So the first thing I recommend is when you're getting people to, or you're reaching out to people on LinkedIn, just don't send friend requests. Put a why I want to, I think put something meaningful so that you stand out. I think that's one important thing. Second is make yourself genuine, because I think there was a post where someone said they're from mechanical engineering and all. And I think sometimes we generalize what we do to our extent without realizing some of the strengths that we have or some of the key interests that makes it interesting for a company. May not be for 10 other companies, but I think, like Sachi said, right, building that narrative, who are you as a person? What are your strengths? I think is extremely important. And if you start with that and reach out with that, I'm sure someone's going to take notice. That being said, the 0 to 1 for a PM, getting into a PM is the most difficult. Sometimes people get internships, sometimes people get it in their own careers as they branch through like I did. But I think patience is something that we need, but we have to keep trying, right? So I'll just take away from that.
Definitely. Thanks for adding that, Aditya. I also have a point of view on that you should, if you're an aspiring PM, network with two kinds of people. One is product managers, one is recruiters. The networking that you do with recruiters is more direct, more transactional, where you're looking for a job and internship directly. But when you're networking with PMs, these are the people who could be your colleagues in the future, who could be your mentors in the future, who could be your managers in the future. And that's where you build or strive for building a relationship. So showing that curiosity that Sachi was talking about, being your genuine self that Aditya was talking about, those are very important when you're trying to build that relationship, and that helps a lot. Cool. With that, we will open the floor for audience question. And the first question that I see is how to pivot to the PM career if I already graduated and currently in another full-time role. The question, I believe, is more of how can one transition from another role to a PM role. There's a follow-up question as well, which talks about how can one transition from data scientist to a PM role in their own organization. Any one of you want to take that?
Sure. I can put it way. So because I'm going to talk through some of my experience. So I never came out of college as a PM. I worked in I've done a pivot shift in quite a few things before I became a PM. Actually, when I graduated, PM wasn't a hot topic. I think there were other roles that were interesting. But I think genuinely, it's a generic question, whether you're a data scientist, engineer. I think empathy to the users, having a real interest in the problem on why we are solving certain things and being able to, gel with a lot of people so that the end product is deliverable. Because at the end of the day, right, what is a PM known for? Like PM is launched for like being empathetic and listening to users, right? Trying to simulate that into meaningful deliverables or use cases and then delivering it, right? So we work with different parts of the organization. I think in my experience working with data scientists, I think it is the easiest job to get to product because you are the people who work closely with data. But your job is not only to be able to say, this test has passed or not. You actually have to make sense of the data. You actually have to see why this impacts a user in a certain way and be able to take that. And the next step is to influence engineers to build a product to go live. And I think if you start showing some of these skills, people start noticing, right? And in my experience, I just took big risk in life, right? I kept talking to people. I was like, I want to do this, and this. When I moved into product, I was not really looking to move into product. I was just trying to do interesting things so I get noticed by other people. And I think product management fell into a lab because I was not interested in engineering over there. I was able to kind of show value between engineering and business, and that's where I was giving an opportunity. And when you get that one opportunity, then you have to take take it up, and you don't have to let it go. So that would be my thing. Again, knowing yourself and branding yourself on what you are good at it comes down to that basically.
Yeah. Also, if you're already working in a product team, you already have skills that a PM needs. Only thing you might need is leadership skills. So if you can showcase that you are a leader, I think the transition to being a PM will be much easier. Next question we have is around screening of resume. So I will rephrase these questions or bucket these questions into how can one stand out when they are applying for these first time PM roles or first time PM internships? What are some tips, tricks that has worked or you have seen working for people?
I think just tactically from my perspective, like applying through LinkedIn never really works in my experience. And I don't think you should waste too much of your time doing that unless it's sort of like a small company, you already know the recruiter, your resume is actually going to sort of be looked at. But I think warm introductions are always the way to go. If you see a job posting on LinkedIn, dig a little deeper, see if you can find employees in that particular team, because at the end of the day, the more you can learn about what that team is doing, I think a lot of people overlook that again, every team is very different, especially these bigger companies like Meta, Adobe. It doesn't matter if you're reaching out to someone on the document cloud side, if you're looking for a job in Creative Cloud as much. So try and find relevant people to that team and set up those sort of conversations with them. So yeah, that would be sort of like my main takeaway.
Yeah. Any other tips, Deepak, Aditya, more around resume? What should be in a resume so that they get screened for interviews?
Yeah, it is always that tricky question, right? Like, because pretty much, like, to be frank, most people are looking for prior experience as a PM when you're applying directly to the website. So I would say, like, if you do not have prior PM experience, then leaning on some of the things that Aditya and Amar talked about in the previous answer are more relevant or better ways to get noticed and get your first PM experience. But once you do have it, I think the key things they're looking for are specific to that company, right? Like if you are a PM at Amazon and you're trying to apply to Google, then there are different skills that the recruiters are looking for, like, more engineering, more design-oriented experiences, for example. So figuring out what kind of PM, what does PM mean at that company, and highlighting that particular skill set would be helpful, would be my advice.
Awesome. Aditya, do you want to add anything to that?
I think Sachi said it well, right? Resumes to some level are overrated because you really don't know where it goes into, right? Into which black hole. And I think networking, creating warm leads and creating a brand for yourself really helps. And I think that goes a long way. That being said, I think resumes, I think most companies have a set template about, have show numbers, show impact, stuff like that. But to Deepak's impact, like if you're screening about 10 resumes, right, at any given point, you're going to lose out if you don't have that PM, stamp on it. And so if that's not the case, then you have to do something extraordinary to show yourself, and creating a blog for yourself, attending conferences are probably the better way to go then.
So one last thing to tack onto that is I feel like when people sort of like think of networking, they overlook relevant people in their own network. Like for me, if anybody's sort of still in school or has connections to professors, a lot of professors in sort of like industries relating to information systems or like design actually have a lot of industry contacts, and they're more than willing to help connect you if you have sort of been a student of theirs. So don't overlook sort of contacts you may have had from university if you were involved in things like the Schwartz Center. The amount of times I asked Dave Mawhinney, who runs the Schwartz Center, to introduce me to a company that I was interested in, and he was willing to do that because I built that rapport. I was his student. So don't overlook those sort of educational contacts and think that they're not relevant for industry.
Awesome. Moving on to next topic, which is quite a few questions around interviewing. Would you be able to share how does PM interviews look like at your organization? And then any tips, advice on how to prepare for that? Starting with maybe Aditya.
I'd like to start with Deepak. I think Deepak, going for Google is the most well-known for its interview. So let's start there because, I think it sets a good stage for most people, right?
Sounds good. Yeah, sure.
Sorry, Deepak, to put you on the spot, but I think
sure thing. Yeah, I've talked about this a little bit. I think it's like interviewing at Google. Like I think right now there are a lot of different companies. Like many tech companies are following similar like Google like design principles when you come to interviews. I feel like Salesforce and a few startups are also leaning towards Google style interviews. So it's the theme that Google kind of ends up following is around design specific case studies. So there are certain books which lean heavily towards the style. If you think about Decode and Conquer or Cracking the PM Interview, these are great books that lead you down this road. And essentially what we're looking for in the interview is seeing if you think like a product manager, right? Like if you talk about like the skills that Aditya had mentioned or like essential skills that a PM needs, we're looking to see if you think about the user. Like if you're asked a question, what is your, how do you improve a product? Whether you answer a question like, hey, I like this particular feature, or if you answer the question as, I think the key user of this feature is this particular persona, and these are their pain points, these are their user journeys. Those are the kind of insights that we look for when you're going through the product interview question. And if you think about how you want to prepare for these, the best way that I found is just practice. Like you really need to start getting comfortable with thinking about the question from the point of lens of user. When you have like 30 minutes in the interview pressure to deliver on these areas, it really helps if you have tried out these questions in the past with some friends and also use some of the guidelines that you see in these books. Those are some of the things that worked out really well. Sending it back to you, Aditya. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think while Google, Meta, Amazon have their own sets and principles, right? Amazon focuses on deep storytelling and going into data points, right? Each of them have a lot of literature. But I think to Deepak's point of view, right, you have to generally be interested in having good product sense, why a product can be built, who the user is, why would they really be, I think it comes down to that when interviewing means answering any interview question, right? I think at Roku, when I interviewed, I think this format was a bit different, but the end result is kind of the same, right? I went in with a presentation on why I really love this company, what I could build out here, and it started a conversation. Obviously, I couldn't skip the product sense and product design questions, but it was also food for thought that I've taken the time to really understand the company, understand where it's going, and that maybe kind of move things a little in my way. I'd like to think about that, right? So I think those are the kind of things. The one tip I would tell people is that, when you're interviewing, you can do a lot of the research, but do a lot of mock interviews and I would say that if you're interviewing at Google and Facebook, never make that your first company you are actually interviewing with, right? Interview with smaller companies, do mock interviews, feel the pressure and prepare for the big company if that's what you're trying to look for. So that's my tip over there.
Awesome. Sachi, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. I think a good first step is having clarity on whether the role that you're applying for is a technical PM role. Obviously, sometimes that's going to be explicitly stated, or maybe just a more general PM role where a technical background is not like necessary. And that depends company to company. That's not always going to be transparent. Going into Adobe, I knew I was going to have like one interview with an engineering manager, but I didn't get the sense that it was going to be anything like heavy in terms of actually, working with numbers myself or coding. And that ended up being the case. It was more just like an interview around what would a relationship look like with an engineering manager, and making sure you sort of understand some of the foundations of what that would look like. So definitely going into an interview, if you can be aware of whether it's a technical PM role or any transparency around that, that's helpful. The other thing that I think Aditya touched on, which is product sense, I think that's really important. It's not going to be something you like are born with. That's something that's developed over time. And so for me, leading up to like my first ever PM interviews, you know, I always wondered, like, what does it mean to have think like a product manager? And there are things you can do just over time that build that and ingrain that. And that's like listening to podcasts. It's hearing the way people communicate and think. So like the product school has like an awesome podcast. And I remember leading up to all these interviews, I used to just like plug it in, listen to a ton of podcasts, like on my way to school, whatever. And the other thing is listening to mock interviews, even if you're not actively setting aside time for you to do them every day, like falling asleep to one. I don't know if that's like a great way to fall asleep, but Exponent is like a great YouTube channel that does these mock interviews. And I remember like taking mental notes of, oh, I like the way this person communicates because it's very clear. They have a framework, they have a structure. And so you're able to sort of start forming threads in like what really product thinking is, and adapt certain things to your style, because there's different styles of communication. And as soon as you can start developing what your style and voice is, that's really helpful going into an interview. So just, I think a big thing is remembering that prep for an interview is not only short term, which is things you can do like reading these books, but it's sort of like a long-term thing of developing that product sense. And you want to make sure you're kind of keeping up with that.
Yeah, awesome. That sounds great. Here at Meta, I would say there are three kinds of interviews when they interview PMs. One is product sense, as everyone talked about. The assessment there is basically if, as a PM, you are able to pick an ambiguous situation, a vague prompt, and drill that down into a specific problem and solution for that problem. Second interview is product execution, which is around identifying if you are a data-driven PM, can you set goals? Can you define what are the metrics that team needs to focus on? And then there's leadership and drive, which is more of a behavioral interview, trying to see your fit, your culture fit, if you are someone who will be fit at Meta. And I would say all the advice and suggestion that the folks here have given are absolutely gems. In addition to that, I would like to say that for product sense specifically, when you're solving a problem, aside from the mock interviews, try to think about those problems for a longer time instead of doing that in buckets of 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Keep thinking about those. What are the other users you could have had for this problem? What are the other solutions you could have built for this problem? What are the other problems you could have identified for these specific users that you identified? And that eventually build a muscle for thinking in product sense. That has something that helped me a lot. There's a question from Andrew, which I would like Andrew to ask directly. Andrew, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Sure. The one I posted in the silo.
Yeah.
All right. Does project or program experience detract from product experience to prospective employers? Or how can I share my project or program experience when transitioning? I ask because my current title is a project manager, but I am not really doing project management. It is more, I think, more along the lines of program management, and I'd like to focus more on the users and less on the internal machinations of the organization and just getting things to work. I hope that question makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting question. I can take a stab at this. So this is one thing that we like to say in MBA is that you want to focus on your transferable skills, and program project experience does have a lot of transferable skills towards product management, right? And I've had people who were earlier program managers who transitioned internally to product managers to my team at Google. So it's definitely a close path that you can find transferable skills to lean heavily on. Product managers who were program managers are really strong in execution, right? Like you can, and that is one of the key things that a product manager is supposed to do. You're supposed to land, deliver outcome, and then, add positive value to the company. And you can lean heavily on your execution strength when you want to transition from a program experience to product. At the same time, you also want to be conscious of the areas that people might assume you do not have experience in, right? Like being a program manager, the things that you may not have done, or you may want to show that you have skills in, is things like more ambiguous, like defining strategy in ambiguous areas, trying to understand user pain points, and showing empathy. Is not generally what you would associate with a program experience. And you may want to showcase areas where you've developed that skill or showcase that skill. And I think putting these two together can help you present a strong portfolio towards transitioning. I definitely think it's a great, place to move into product experience.
Awesome. Thanks for answering that, Deepak.
Thank you so much.
There's a question around tools in product analytics. I wanted to generalize this question a little bit. What are the tools that a product manager should absolutely know to handle and work on? And what are the common myths around it?
I'd love to hear others answer this question, and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, I'll take it. I think from my experience, I think it's a good question. I think the amount of tools that are used today are like mind-bogglingly. There are a lot of tools that you can use today, right, to make a project successful. Jira, Notion, Confluence, etc. Project trackers, analytics tool, right? I think where we try to index, I think it depends on where you are, right? So if you're trying to get a PM interview, it almost doesn't matter what tools you know, what tools you don't know, right? I think when you get into a company, whether you are the master champion of Jira, if they don't use Jira for tracking, you're going to have to learn the new tool. So I wouldn't over-index on like what tools I don't know. But I think when it comes to like data and ability to read data, I think things like Tableau, right, running a SQL query, I think that familiarity is very important. And I think to answer that earlier question from Andrew as well, right, I think the one thing people, like when you're moving into a role and you're not a PM and you're moving into a role, ability to ask why and ask the question why are we doing something, so what, and try to formulate an answer or a hypothesis using data is an absolute skill set. Knowing a tool is actually irrelevant. I think we all are smart people coming from Carnegie Mellon. If you can run an Excel, you're going to be able to learn a tool, right? I wouldn't over-index on that. But I think reading data is a skill set that I think Sachi said you can develop. And I think practicing, looking at charts, looking at different kind of graphs and kind of making your own hypothesis also helps you build product sense. And I would say let's focus on that rather than what tools we know.
Yeah, +1 to everything Aditya said. And it's funny because I think going into my first role, I was sort of the same mentality. It was like, what tools can I like start, becoming familiar with to prepare for this role? So I remember like a few months before I started my job, I emailed my manager and I was like that over enthusiastic kid. And I was like, are there any tools you want me to learn before I start my job? And, she replied with like, no, just like use our product, like get to know our product. And so if there's a particular company you're shooting for, the only tool you really, really need to know in depth is that company's product. Make sure you know that inside out, make sure you can understand all the workflows associated with that. And so, yeah, everything you really do learn a lot on the spot. I think knowing how to optimize for communication tools is really helpful. So like making really nice slide decks is awesome because if you're, selling a point of view, being able to communicate that in a way that's digestible by like a wide variety of stakeholders, whether that's designers or engineers, that's a helpful skill, but you can make great slides through multiple tools. So it's more sort of the soft skills. And to Aditya's point, being able to sort of use data to back your insights is extremely important. And that's something I wish I kind of took more advantage of while I was at CMU, was really learning how to, command data rather than it being something I'm scared of. And so that's something I'm working on today. So definitely, I wouldn't stress on a particular tool, but rather the skill sets that those tools represent.
Yep, I totally agree, and this was a shocker for me. Like I thought that when I joined Google, I was like, okay, so there must be like some really complex tools that everybody at all the other PMs are using for road mapping and wireframing and everything. And then I Googled we have our internal search engine, like product management tools, right? And nothing showed up. And then after being a PM for 3 years, I realized the tools that I actually end up using is like Google Docs, Google Sheets, Google Slides. Like that's pretty much your tools, right? Like your most of your job is around communication, driving alignment and so on. And whatever method, like means of communication that you find most helpful, like Gmail, like Google Docs, like that's really your tool of use, right? Sure, there are a lot of helpful tools to do analytics. I mean, I do think that learning SQL is a really great skill set to do your data analytics and metrics calculations. But at the end of the day, there are different ways to get your insights. What really matters, like a tool means like something that helps you get your job done. It's a lot about communication, and you better get used to writing like docs, whatever, Word or Google Docs really well. That's the tool I would recommend you to get used to.
Right. I also believe it's also size of the company, like large funded companies like Google, Meta, Adobe, Roku. You have your partners, you have your teammates who do a lot of work for you. For a smaller startup, you might have to get your hands dirty, maybe doing a mock, a wireframe, or writing SQL queries. So it actually depends, I would say, but for a larger company, writing is your tool, and that's how you scale your team. So just to sum up.
I think, Amar, I think that's an important thing, right? A meta point over here, I think what Sachi made is important, is that think about what makes you successful, right? Writing great documentation, right? Or PRD is what you call it, product requirement documentation. I will say rather than the tool, getting better at writing, putting data into insight to convince users is probably the most undervalued or underspoken skill set that PMs do. And I think improving on that really will help you succeed at the job. May not help you get the PM role, but definitely helps you succeed in the role.
Yeah, absolutely. I had no idea I had to write so much. I was not a fan of it before, but then you really have to like get over writer's block. There are some weeks when I don't feel like writing much, and I realize I don't get much work done. Like it's like you got to write pages every day. That's really how you get things done.
Awesome. We have last 3 minutes left, and we'll take one last question, which is around mock interviews, how to go about them, how to find partners for mock interviews. Do you guys have any tips, tricks around that?
The Exponent, I think one of the things that someone told me about is Exponent, right? I think you pay for something, but I think it's worth the investment. But you can do daily mocks with people, and the engine finds you mock partners. I think that is one thing that I'm familiar about. Love to hear if Deepak and Sachi had any recommendations, or even you, Amar, right? Exponent is solving that problem.
Yeah, in my opinion, there are multiple Slack channels which solve for this. I know a couple of them. One is by the author of the book Decode and Conquer, Lewis Lynn. He runs a Slack channel where you can find mock partners for yourself. There's something other called Stellar Peers. They are also running a similar Slack channel, and there are tons of them in my opinion. What is important is you find a mock partner which is relevant or calibrated to your skill sets or your level of experience. And also, if someone is preparing for the similar companies that you are, that helps a lot in mock interviews, in my opinion. I won't over-index on mock interview. I know the panelists here have been vocal about taking a lot of mock interviews. Personally, I don't testify to that. I would say solving those problems is important because as you go along, you realize your own mistakes. And having a sounding board helps definitely, but solving those problems is more important. Practicing, I would say.
I think the other risk with mock interviews is it's really easy to sort of like categorize product questions into these like categories that you find in mock interviews. Like, oh, it's a design question, design a bicycle for blind people. Like I never once got a question like that in my actual interview. And so if you get too structured in the way you think an interview is going to go, when you get to the actual room, you're going to focus more on like, oh, which category of type of question is this, rather than like think like a product manager. And so one thing I found really helpful is adapt any projects you've done in your past. It could be a project you've done in school, personal project, and talk through that to yourself or someone else the way a product manager was. What was like the inception of the idea behind that project? Did you do any research or foundation to kind of validate why you want to go down that path? Did you work in an iterative cycle? So it doesn't actually have to be a project that relates to like, new product development, but it can be a project you did from start to finish and apply product thinking to that. And so the more familiar you get with sort of like that type of thinking with things you've already done in your life, you're not going to rely on these like overly structured like buckets of questions and then fumble when you get to the main stage.
But so I had a point on that, right, Amar, is that like say, and I think this is the case with someone like Google who has a very defined structure of interviewing, right? Versus other companies that are more bespoke based on what Sachi said, right? It could be more about a project you've done. I think what most people do is like mock is do it and forget it. And I think a point is the mock really helps you think on the spot when you have some time. What people overthink about it is like, hey, you have to get the answer right. And I think it's less about that. It's about how you frame your conversation. But at the end of the day, it comes down to communication in the interview process. And that's what you're getting back at, right? I think to your point, thinking about solutions and how you'll improve things outside of a mock interview helps you build better solutions. But I think sometimes when I'm taking interviews, I've realized that the person is really smart, but is not able to connect the dots at times. And a little practice goes a long way in that time, right? So I think that's where mock interviews sometimes help. So
Definitely, yeah. Awesome. We are at time, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks to our panelists, Aditya, Deepak, and Sachi for answering all our questions. And special thanks to Chitis for bringing us all together. There's a message that Chitis has put up, which is about SF Startup Meetup at Rooftop. Please feel free to RSVP to that event, and maybe we'll see you all there.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this amazing panel discussion. And we would reach out later to share the best way to reach our panelists, including our moderator. So look out for that.
Awesome, guys. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening.